Russia is waging a political war or an information war, not only against Ukraine, but also against the West, against the global South, and also it is waging an information war on its own population. And we can distinguish between these four major audiences. Ukraine is one of them. And usually we are talking here about various sets of narratives that I also distinguish between strategic narratives and tactical narratives. Strategic narratives or strategic culture is a set of narratives that reflect the genuine understanding or an interpretation, genuine interpretation by the Russian elites of the Russian-Ukrainian war. These are their true beliefs. This is not disinformation. This is not lies that they produce with tactical narratives sometimes, but these are real their own beliefs. And there are several strategic narratives that Russia is trying to put onto its own population, but also the world. And one of the major narratives here, strategic narratives, is that Russia is a separate civilization. Russia is not part of Europe. Russia is not part of the West. It's not part of Asia. It's a civilization on its own terms. And this is from this you can have many other strategic narratives. Some of them relate also to Ukraine. Russia uses social networks, but also in the internet in general, in order to promote its own narratives, strategic and also tactical narratives. If we're talking about Ukraine as the major audience, I would here distinguish also between two different Ukrainian audiences. One audience is the Ukrainians who are living currently under occupation, under Russian occupation. On those, as we call it, temporarily occupied territories. And there also you can see different audiences. For example, the Crimean audience is very much different from the audiences in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People Republics. To the Crimean audience, the narrative is about it's actually not very much different from what the Kremlin and its channels are using against its own population, domestic population in Russia. It's basically domestic Russian insights, domestic Russian ideas about the unity of the Russian people. But with the Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic, they, for a very long time, they really pushed the narrative that it is probably a true Ukraine, which is friendly towards Russia. So they did not address to those audiences as their domestic audience. This changed after the formal annexation of those territories last year in autumn 2022. But there is another audience on the occupied territories, which they call new Russian territories. And this is Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, which they claim to have annexed. And there they are actually experimenting, because the narratives that they tried to use, the narratives that were tailored first for Crimean audience and then for the audience of the Donbass, they failed. They don't work. And they're experimenting. And it also shows us how flexible, actually, the Russian propaganda machine is. It may produce some ideas, may produce some propaganda tricks, and then they try to measure, then they try to evaluate whether those ideas actually work. And they do this through public opinion polls, through focus groups. So they try to measure everything that they do. And now they're still experimenting, like what particular ideas would work with the audiences in these more recently occupied territories. But this is one, one can say several audiences, but then there is another major audience, which is Ukraine proper, which is under the legitimate control of the Kiev authorities. And here you have various channels. They are, of course, using or trying to use the, as I said, social networks which are used by Ukrainians. And these are, well, all the major social networks. It's Facebook, it's ex-Twitter, it's Instagram, it's TikTok, and of course it's Telegram. Interestingly, they stopped using VK in order to reach Ukrainians because of the ban, essentially, on VK in Ukraine. Odnoklassniki, they actually never really used them because it's a very fringe social network. But all the 5 major networks that Ukrainians are themselves using, so they are also exploited by the Russian propaganda machine. Sometimes also websites, but social networks are the most important instrument, because these social networks, there you actually can find Ukrainians, using them. And because any political war tries to change the behavior of the nation that we consider to be an enemy nation, this is the main field of work and influence. Ukrainians who live abroad, they who fled as refugees or who have been living in the West, or at least abroad, even before the start of the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, they live in the same information space as Ukrainians who live in Ukraine. The fact that they have moved away from Ukraine, it doesn't mean that they have moved in the information terms. Yeah, they're still in this information bubble, which is not very different from the information bubble where Ukrainians living in Ukraine live. So there isn't much difference here. There are several organizations that are involved in the Russian propaganda operations on the professional level. And I'm saying professional level because there are also many minor organizations and also freelancers in Russia who are trying to wage a political war against Ukraine, but also against the West on their own, and also in order to then somehow ask from the Kremlin or from the structures of the Kremlin to reward them for what they're doing. So it's also very widespread, and there are dozens of those minor organizations and people, and I wouldn't go into detail here because really these are just many. These minor groups or individuals, also Telegram channels, they're trying to build their capital by doing this, in order to then have an access to the resources that the Kremlin controls. But at the same time, there are a few organizations that do this professionally. And these are the same organizations that have worked with Russian domestic politicians, basically these political technologists, firms, consultancy firms that provide information support during election campaigns or various other campaigns that are happening in Russia. And also the same structures are used by the Kremlin to wage an information war against Ukraine. And there are, I will mention 3 of them. One is the Social Design Agency, which was founded by a person called Ilya Gambashidze. He is now sanctioned by the EU for his involvement in the political war. And another organization that he founded along with the Social Design Agency is called Struktura. So these 2 organizations that are most active in spreading pro-Kremlin, anti-Ukrainian propaganda, addressing the Ukrainian audience on the territories controlled by the Kiev authorities, and also some Western audiences, especially in France and Germany, but also in the EU in general. Here also we can add the agency called Dialogue or Dialogue. That's a third organization that is professionally involved in the information war against Ukraine or related to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And it's also sanctioned by the EU. So one of the information operations that became notorious, a Russian influence operation that was devised by social design agency and Struktura, is called Doppelganger operation, and it consisted in producing fake screenshots or fake websites that tried to mimic some of the established websites, such as BBC, for example, or The Guardian, or German well-established media like Die Welt. They tried to they built websites that looked like those established media, or at least they would produce screenshots. Then they would spread or distribute those screenshots in the social media, and that looked really reliable in a sense, because people saw that, yeah, well, it's a screenshot from the established news agency that we read, that we trust, and that those screenshots would then be reproduced. And unfortunately, as we know, people are very rarely double-check information on the internet. They trust some visual confirmations that this is a trusted source. And this is what they did. It's called a Doppelganger. Doppelganger is from Germany. It's like a ghost, like a double of a real person. So this is what they did, and that operation was devised by the by Struktura and social design agency. Currently, the Russian propaganda machine aims at promoting 4 major ideas, or they have established 4 narratives and also 4 objectives, which are the following. It's the demobilization of the Ukrainian population, it's demoralization of the armed forces, it's fragmentation of the elites, and it's discreditation of the martial law. So these are 4 major objectives that they try to reach through different means, different media, as well, social media, also websites, but mostly social media, and also working with particular, sometimes even Ukrainian influencers, using different instruments, trying to inject particular ideas into the mainstream Ukrainian discussions. And then through the process, which I call narrative laundering, it's like money laundering, which, when people try to conceal the source of the money. Also the process of concealing the source of the narratives. And if this narrative, which originates from the Russian propaganda machine, becomes a legitimate element of the Ukrainian mainstream discussions, then the narrative laundering is successful. But these four major objectives, these are currently the aims of the propaganda machine, because obviously you cannot have successful, efficient resistance from Ukraine if you don't have united elites, if you don't have mobilized population that supports the army. Of course, the demoralization of the enemy is one of the major objectives in any war. This is what Ukraine is also doing in its own information attacks against the Russian state. And if of course the fragmentation of the elites, and these are major objectives now. Unfortunately, I must say that it is much more problematic when it comes to countering the propaganda messages, countering disinformation. And I must also say that disinformation is not a necessary element of the propaganda machine or the political war. These may be even legitimate facts, legitimate information that is being exploited and weaponized in the political war. But I would here mention probably two instruments that I think can be useful in countering the political war. One is pre-bunking. Debunking is a method that is different from debunking. Debunking is when you hear or when you read a propaganda narrative or some piece of fake news, essentially, some piece of disinformation, and then you're saying, well, this is a lie, and the truth is this and this and this. This is debunking. You're debunking disinformation. But pre-bunking is much more efficient. The reason why the background of this discussion is coming from psychology, but also from media studies. Psychologically, a person, when he or she hears some information that is not familiar to them, people used to believe the first interpretation that they hear about those events, about those developments. And what is more, a person would also then defend this first interpretation that they hear against all other interpretations. So if the media or Russian state-controlled media produce the first interpretation of a particular development, people just psychologically, they stick to this interpretation. They may change their mind, but at first they will be defending this first interpretation. So what is pre-bunking? Pre-bunking is like inoculation. You inoculate. You're producing a vaccine against the disinformation that you may hear in the future. For example, if I tell you that tomorrow Moscow will produce a narrative, Moscow will produce a piece of information about something that will happen, and I will tell you what this interpretation will look like. So when it happens, you will remember my words, and you will also have an understanding that this is actually coming from Moscow. This is actually coming from the Kremlin. One very good example, essentially it's a perfect example of how pre-bunking works, is if we compare the situation in February 2014, when the end of February 2014 and the beginning of March 2014, when the Russians started to occupy Crimea with the use of green little men. So many in the West were confused about what was happening. Maybe those are, just pro-Russian separatists or people who didn't like the Maidan, but maybe just a legitimate protest against what was happening in Kiev. So for a couple of weeks, the West was indeed quite confused. Obviously, the secret services and special agencies in the West knew what was happening, but the population was confused, and they could not put any pressure on their authorities to act about, the blatant violation of the international law. But it was very different with February 2022, because the US, the American agencies, together with their allies, especially in the UK, they pre-bunked what would be happening against Ukraine. So when the full-blown invasion of Ukraine happened on the 24th of February, everybody in the West knew, because they were pre-bunked. They wouldn't believe any disinformation that the Kremlin would produce, because they already knew what was happening. And this is how this is the difference between debunking, what was happening, say, in March 2014, when the Ukrainian authorities tried to explain to everybody, no, the Russian occupation is happening. You need to believe, our truth against the Russian so-called truth. And February 2022, this is how pre-bunking worked. This is about pre-bunking. Another instrument that I believe is very important is actually quite simple, because sometimes it is very efficient just to repeat your information as often as possible. It's a victory by the numbers. if you just flood the information space with your information, with your own narratives, with your own ideas, the numbers will just do their job. It's as simple as that. And this is what the Russians are doing. It's if you look at how they work, if they look at how the Russian news agencies work, they repeat these lies time and time again, and they do not stop. They produce dozens of thousands of the same messages with the same words. And so, again, psychologically, because when we're talking about propaganda, disinformation, it's all about psychology. It's all about how people themselves consume information and what they tend to believe. So just psychologically, if people keep seeing the same sentences, the same ideas every day, they would at some point consider this as the only truth. And everything that rejects these ideas is not a truth, it's a lie. So again, playing with psychology, or using psychology to understand the challenge, I think, is one of the major instruments that we can use to counter the Russian propaganda machine.